Marena Calloway was 21 years old when she stood in the frost-cracked yard of the only home she had ever known and watched a stranger nail a bank notice to her father's door. She had no mother to turn to, no brothers to stand beside her, and no more than $14 sewn into the lining of her coat, the whole of what remained after her step-uncle. Walton Pruitt declared her no fit heir to a dead man's trade and sent her down the mountain road with a borrowed mule and a single trunk. 3 weeks later, half-starved and sleeping in church pews, she stood in a Larkspur Hollow courthouse and raised her hand for the only lot nobody else wanted, $9 for an abandoned rail depot and a half-mile of rusted spur track that the county itself had tried to give away for a decade. Folks in the room laughed under their breath. They called it cursed ground, the old copper vein line, sealed since a shipment vanished into the mountain 90 years before and never came out. What Marena did not know, what no living soul in Larkspur Hollow knew, was that the shipment had never really vanished at all. It was still there, still loaded, still waiting behind a wall of stone for someone patient enough, and honest enough, to find it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marena Calloway. If you are watching this from a town the world stopped paying attention to, tell us where you're from in the comments. We'd love to know we're not the only ones who still believe forgotten places remember everything. Marena had grown up in the shadow of the Coldwater Range, in a two-room house behind her father's forge, where the ring of hammer on iron was the first sound she heard most mornings and the last she heard most nights. Thomas Calloway was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one, and he raised his only daughter the way he shaped iron, slowly, with attention, testing every joint before he trusted it to hold weight. Her mother had died when Marena was 6, of a fever that swept through Larkspur Hollow one wet spring, and after that it had been the two of them, father and daughter, in a town that never quite decided what to make of a girl who could read a ledger faster than the men who kept it and who spent her Saturdays not sewing but standing at her father's elbow, learning to judge the true weight of a horseshoe by feel alone. Thomas never discouraged her curiosity. He used to say that most people mistook plainness for worthlessness, and that the surest way to be robbed in this world was to believe that only shining things had value. He said it about scrap iron, about tired horses, about the quiet neighbors nobody invited to supper, and he said it, more than once, about his own grandfather, a man named Ezra Calloway who had worked the old copper vein tramway back before Thomas was even born and whose name, for reasons Thomas would only half explain, was not one they spoke of freely in town. All Thomas would say was that Ezra had been blamed for something he did not do, that the shame of it had followed the family down 2 generations like a debt nobody could pay off, and that someday, if the Lord was patient with them, the truth would surface the way truth generally did, slowly, and from underneath. Marena grew up turning that unfinished story over in her mind the way she turned over a good piece of iron, waiting to see where the weak point was. She learned bookkeeping from the itinerant preacher who boarded with them one winter, a quiet, bespectacled man named Reverend Ashby who noticed her quickness with figures and taught her, in exchange for mending his coats, how to balance a column of debits against a column of credits until the two sides agreed like a held note resolving into harmony. She learned to read survey maps from an old freight agent named Corliss who owed her father a debt for a repaired axle and paid it instead in Saturday afternoons spent unrolling yellowed maps across the forge's workbench, showing her how to read a grade by its shading, how to tell a true property line from a surveyor's careless guess, how a river's bend on paper could hide a dispute that would outlast every man who'd ever drawn it. And she learned, most of all, patience, the particular, unglamorous patience of a girl who had been taught that most treasures in this world are found not by luck but by people willing to look twice at something everyone else had already looked away from. Her father used to set a bent, rusted nail before her sometimes and ask her what it was worth, and when she said nothing, he would straighten it in the fire, true it on the anvil, and hand it back to her, saying, "Now what is it worth?" It was a small lesson, repeated so many times she stopped noticing she was learning it, and yet it was the lesson that would matter most, years later, when everything else her father had given her, his name, his forge, his good standing in the world, had been stripped away and all that remained was the way he'd taught her to look at a broken thing before deciding it was worthless. She did not know, in those years, that this patience would someday be the only inheritance she had left, or that it would prove to be worth far more than the forge, the house, or any of the money her father spent his whole life carefully setting aside. Thomas Calloway died in the autumn Marena turned 21, taken fast by the same kind of fever that had claimed her mother, and in the 6 terrible weeks that followed she learned exactly how little the world honored a daughter's grief. Walton Pruitt, her stepuncle by her father's late second marriage, arrived from the county seat within days of the funeral carrying papers he claimed proved the forge and the house had been willed to him, not to her, on account of her being, in his words, a woman unfit to hold property nor sense enough to run a man's business. Marena had never trusted Walton, a thin, cold-eyed man who had visited perhaps 3 times in her life and never once brought so much as a kind word, and she suspected, though she could never prove it, not then, that the papers he waved before the county clerk had been altered after her father's death, not drawn up honestly before it. The ink on the signature line sat a shade darker than the rest of the page, and the date, she was almost certain, had been written in a different hand than the body of the will itself. But she had no money for a lawyer, no male relation to speak for her, and no standing in a courtroom that assumed a grieving daughter's protest was simply female hysteria, and so she watched Walton's claim go unchallenged, watched the county clerk stamp it without a second glance, and understood in that moment something bitter about how easily a life's careful work could be undone by a single piece of paper and a man's confident voice. Within a month the forge was sold to a man from Denver, the house went with it, and Walton pocketed every dollar, tossing Marena $14 out of Christian charity, and telling her, not unkindly but not kindly either, that a smart girl would find a husband quick before winter closed the roads. She did not cry in front of him. She had learned that much from her father too, that dignity, once surrendered, was hard to win back, and so she packed her trunk, took the mule he grudgingly allowed her, and rode away from Coldwater Ridge with nothing but her father's old ledger book, a Bible, and the strange unfinished story of Ezra Calloway rattling around in the back of her mind like a key with no lock to fit. She slept in church pews in 2 different towns, mended dresses for coins, went 2 days once without a proper meal and told herself it was only practice for harder days that might come, and finally arrived in Larkspur Hollow, a played-out mining town clinging to the base of the mountain her great-grandfather had once worked, half-starved and down to her last few dollars, on the very week the county was clearing its books of unpaid, unwanted properties. That was how she came to be standing in that courthouse, cold and proud and nearly penniless, when the auctioneer read out a lot nobody wanted, the old copper vein depot and spur, forfeited to the county 90 years prior and never claimed since, going for whatever anyone was foolish enough to offer. The depot itself, when she finally walked its grounds the next morning, looked less like property and more like a wound the mountain had never quite closed over. The station house sagged on its foundation, its windows long since broken and boarded by nobody in particular, its platform boards soft with rot beneath her boots, and the rails beyond it ran a bare half-mile up a brush-choked grade before disappearing into the black mouth of a tunnel that the town, she quickly learned, had spent 90 years walking around rather than through. An old woman who kept a boarding house nearby, a widow named Hetty Sloan with a memory for gossip sharper than any ledger, told her, in the hushed tone people use for things they don't quite believe but repeat anyway, that back in 1890 a supply run had gone up that grade one October evening carrying the whole season's payroll and provisions for the Coldwater mine, and had simply never come back down. No wreck was ever found on the open track. No bodies. The company sent men up with lanterns and they found the tunnel mouth caved in from what everyone assumed was a natural slide, and rather than dig 90 feet of solid rock to recover a single or car, the Copper Vein Company had simply written the whole shipment off, blamed a missing brakeman named Ezra Calloway for supposedly diverting the load before the collapse, and folded within the year, taking half the town's livelihood down with it. Marena stood very still when she heard that name. She did not tell Hetty Sloan that Ezra Calloway had been her own great-grandfather, that she had grown up hearing her father defend a dead man's honor without ever knowing quite what he was defending it against. She only asked, as evenly as she could manage, whether anyone had ever gone back in to look. The old woman laughed, not unkindly, and said the tunnel had been sealed by a rockslide for 90 years and nobody in Larkspur Hollow had money to spare digging up old ghosts, that the mountain had swallowed the shipment same as it had swallowed half the men who once worked it, and that a sensible girl would sell the useless lot back to the county the moment she found someone fool enough to buy it. Marena walked back to her $9 depot that evening with her heart going like a hammer against iron, and that night, by the light of a single candle stub, she opened the station's rusted-shut record cabinet and found, still legible under 90 years of dust, the dispatcher's logbook from the very week the shipment disappeared. The logbook was written in a careful, unhurried hand, and Marena recognized within the first few pages that whoever had kept it, a dispatcher named Osgood Farr, according to the flyleaf, had recorded not just arrival and departure times but small, human observations of the men who worked the line, the kind of details a careless clerk would never have bothered to note, which brakeman favored which mule, which foreman's cough had worsened through the wet season, small human bookkeeping alongside the freight totals. It was there, on a page dated 3 days before the October collapse, that she found the first true thread of the mystery, an entry noting that a man from the rival Ridgeline Freight outfit had been seen twice at the tunnel mouth after hours, once asking after the timber shoring, and once simply standing, watching, saying nothing when hailed. Ridgeline Freight, she would learn over the following days of careful reading, had spent 2 years trying and failing to buy out the Copper Vein Company's mountain rights, and had been publicly humiliated when Copper Vein refused their final offer that same autumn. Osgood Farr's log grew steadily more anxious as the days passed, a note about missing blasting powder from the company store, a note about the mine foreman's worry over loose talk of trouble on the grade. And finally, on the night of the collapse itself, a hurried, blotted entry recording that brakeman Ezra Calloway had gone up with the evening supply run against Farr's own advice, because Calloway believed something was wrong at the tunnel and had insisted on riding it through himself rather than send a green hand. After that entry, the logbook simply stopped, the last page torn raggedly along its inner edge as though someone, sometime, had wanted a piece of it gone. Marena sat with the book open on her lap long after the candle had burned down to nothing, understanding for the first time that the story her father had refused to finish was not a story of a thief who had run off with the company's money, but very possibly the story of a man who had died trying to stop one. In the days that followed, Marena did what her father had taught her to do with any piece of iron whose true shape she could not yet see. She tested it from every angle before she trusted her own eye. She rode into the county seat and paid a clerk 2 of her last dollars to let her search the old company filings, spending a long, dusty afternoon working through boxes nobody had opened in decades, and found there the original insurance claim Copper Vein Company had filed after the collapse, a claim that blamed the disaster on a natural slide, 'cause unknown. With no mention whatsoever of theft or of Ezra Calloway, despite the fact that the town's memory, passed mouth to mouth for 90 years, insisted he had stolen the shipment and run. Somewhere between the company's quiet, honest filing and the town's loud, dishonest gossip, her great-grandfather's name had been deliberately rewritten, and Marena began to understand why, because within 18 months of the collapse, it was not Copper Vein but Ridgeline Freight that had quietly purchased the mountain's mineral rights, the water rights to Larkspur Creek, and most of the depot land around it, for pennies on the dollar, from a company too broke and too humiliated to fight for what remained. The Ridgeline man who had signed those purchase papers was named Absalom Dunmore, and Marena, walking Larkspur Hollow's single dusty street a few days later, discovered with a slow cold understanding that the largest building in town, the bank, the mercantile, and the water company that charged every farmer in the valley for the privilege of drinking from a creek that had once run free, all bore the name of his grandson, a smooth, careful man called Silas Dunmore, who had inherited not only his grandfather's fortune but, it seemed, a very particular interest in making sure nobody ever went looking too closely at how that fortune had begun. She resolved, sitting alone in her drafty depot house with Osgood Farr's logbook open on the table before her, that she would go up the mountain herself, however long it took her, however much digging her own 2 hands could manage without help she couldn't afford to hire, and find out what truly lay behind that 90-year seal of stone. It took her the better part of 6 weeks of solitary, unglamorous labor, working before dawn and after dusk so the townsfolk who already whispered about the strange orphan girl squatting in the cursed depot would not see and mock her further, clearing brush from the old grade with a borrowed billhook until her palms blistered and then calloused, shoring the crumbling trestle with timber she salvaged from her own station house, and finally, with a pick and a prayer, breaking through the loose outer rubble of the rock slide to find, astonishingly, that only the first several feet of the tunnel had truly collapsed. The rest of the passage beyond stood intact, dry, and undisturbed, sealed off from the world like a held breath. What she found inside, when she finally squeezed her lantern through the gap on a cold December evening, was not a wrecked or scattered ruin but a single car sitting square on its rails exactly where it had stopped 90 years before, its coupling still true, its canvas tarpaulins rotted but its crates beneath still stacked and sound, still holding, as she pried the first lid loose with trembling hands, the mine's entire lost October payroll in silver coin, sealed. Provision stores that had survived remarkably well in the dry mountain air, and, wedged behind the strongbox where it had evidently been hidden in haste, a small oilskin packet containing Ezra Calloway's own brakeman's ledger and a hastily scrawled letter in his hand, dated the very night of the collapse, naming Absalom Dunmore directly and describing how he, Ezra, had discovered blasting powder wired into the tunnel's timber shoring and had ridden the supply run-up alone specifically to disarm it and save the load, only for the charge to go off regardless before he could finish, sealing him inside with the very shipment he had died trying to protect. Word travels fast in a small town even when nobody wants it to, and it was not 3 days after Marena's discovery that Silas Dunmore himself came riding down to the depot, dressed in a fine coat entirely wrong for mountain mud, offering to buy the depot, the spur, and, whatever curiosities, she'd found up that old tunnel for a sum that would have seemed, to the girl who'd arrived in Larkspur Hollow with $14, like an unimaginable fortune. He was courteous about it, even warm, the way a man is warm when he has practiced being warm for exactly this kind of moment, and he spoke of protecting a young woman alone from a burden too heavy for her, in a tone that Marena recognized, with a small cold shock, as nearly identical to the tone Walton Pruitt had used the day he'd sent her off the mountain with $14 and a mule. Marena understood at once what the offer really was, not generosity but panic dressed as generosity, and she understood, too, exactly what her great-grandfather's letter meant in Silas Dunmore's careful, unsettled eyes, the way his gaze had gone to the oilskin packet on her table and stayed there a beat too long. She told him, politely but without flinching, that the depot was not for sale, and that she intended to see the payroll returned to the mining families it had always belonged to and Ezra Calloway's name cleared in the county record where it had been wrongly stained. Dunmore's manner cooled considerably after that. Within the week, notices began appearing that the water company, his water company, would be raising rates on any property drawing from Larkspur Creek without a properly registered deed, and Marena's depot, sitting as it did on land whose original deed had been muddled in the very same forfeiture that let her buy it for $9, was suddenly the subject of a legal challenge Dunmore's own lawyer filed within days, claiming the county had never possessed clear title to sell her in the first place. A hired hand of Dunmore's, a broad, unpleasant man named Cobb, took to loitering near the depot gate at odd hours, never quite threatening but never quite leaving either, and one morning Marena found the freshly cleared grate above the tunnel scattered again with brush and stone, as though someone had spent a night trying, half-heartedly, to bury what she'd worked 6 weeks to uncover. Townsfolk who had laughed at her a few weeks earlier now eyed her with a wary, complicated interest, unsure whether to believe the wild talk of buried treasure or the louder, better-funded talk that the strange Calloway girl was a fraud stirring up trouble against a family that had, whatever its faults, kept Larkspur Hollow's lights on for 2 generations. Old Hetty Sloane, who had warned her against the tunnel that first week, was among the very few who came quietly to the depot one evening with a basket of bread and the plain, unadorned statement that she'd always thought it strange the Calloway name got blamed so thoroughly when it was the Dunmores who ended up owning half the valley afterward. Marena felt, for the first time since her father's funeral, the old cold fear of being alone against men with more money and more standing than she would ever have, but she also felt, holding Ezra's letter in her hands each night by candlelight, that some debts were worth being afraid for. She did not fight Dunmore the way he expected her to. Instead of hiding the payroll or bargaining privately, she rode to the county courthouse and filed the entire find into open record, the recovered silver, Osgood Farr's dispatcher log, and Ezra Calloway's letter, as a formal claim on behalf of the original copper vein mining families and their descendants, most of whom, she had learned from careful weeks of asking around, still lived scattered through the valley in exactly the kind of hard, water-starved poverty that Dunmore's rate hikes had deepened for decades. The county clerk, an honest if timid man named Prosper Wheat, could not in good conscience bury a filing so thoroughly documented, and within a fortnight a state mining inspector arrived from Denver to examine the recovered ledger and letter himself, followed shortly after by a newspaperman who found the whole affair, as newspapermen generally do, considerably more interesting than Dunmore would have liked. The inspector's report, read aloud in the courthouse to a room far fuller than the one that had auctioned off Marena's depot months before, confirmed what the letter had claimed: the blasting charge that sealed the tunnel had been set deliberately, its wiring consistent with sabotage rather than any natural slide, and Ezra Calloway's actions on the night of the collapse were, in the inspector's own careful words, those of a man attempting rescue, not robbery. Faced with a public record he could no longer control and a letter in his own grandfather's schemed hand naming names, Silas Dunmore did not go to prison. The crime, after all, was 90 years cold, and its author 90 years dead, but he lost, in short order and in full public view, the water company's exclusive charter, which the county revoked on grounds the original purchase had been fraudulently obtained, and with it the leverage his family had held over Larkspur Hollow since the year the tunnel fell. He left the valley within the season, his fine coat and his careful warmth no longer of any use to him in a town that had finally been shown, in black and white, exactly what his family's fortune had cost. Marena, for her part, refused every dollar of reward the recovered payroll's rightful value might have brought her personally, and instead petitioned the county to use it exactly as it had been intended 90 years before, to restore the town it was meant to save. The old mine machinery was too rusted to matter, but the silver, carefully appraised and distributed, paid off decades of families' water debts in a single winter, funded a proper schoolhouse to replace the leaking one-room shack Larkspur Hollow's children had shivered through for years, and dug, at last, an honest public well so no family would ever again pay a Dunmore for the right to drink from their own creek. Hetty Sloane, who had once called the depot cursed ground, was the one who suggested the well be named for Ezra Calloway, and the town, to its own quiet surprise, agreed without argument. And so it was that Marena Calloway, 21 years old and cast out with $14 by a man who called her unfit to hold property, came at last to hold more of Larkspur Hollow's future in her two hands than anyone in the valley, including the man who had once tried to buy her silence. She had spent $9 on a lot nobody wanted because it was the only lot she could afford, not because she believed, that first cold morning in the courthouse, that anything sealed in that mountain would ever be worth finding. What she carried into that purchase was not luck but the same patient, unglamorous attention her father had taught her at his forge, the conviction that a thing's worth is not always visible on its surface, that a name blackened by rumor deserves the same careful testing as a piece of iron before you trust the story told about it, and that the quietest, most overlooked corners of a town often hold exactly the truth that town has spent generations too afraid, or too comfortable, to go looking for. She had Ezra Calloway's name formally cleared in the county record that spring, had a small stone marker set at the tunnel mouth bearing his name and the plain word, faithful, and stood before it on the day it was unveiled, 90 years almost to the season since he had ridden up that grade alone to save a shipment nobody living remembered was worth saving. Settle into that thought for a moment, if you will, that the same girl the world once called worthless was the one who finally proved a dead man's worth, and in doing so, restored an entire town's. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Marena Calloway. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who loves a slow, honest tale of patience rewarded, and if you have a moment, leave us a comment telling us this: what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every one of them, and we're always glad to hear from you. Until next time, stay close.